I imagine, like me, whenever you discover a new YouTube channel, you immediately sort by popularity to see which video took off for that creator and why. Was it released at the right time, aptly capturing the discourse or newsworthiness, or did audiences decide this one video best summed up the channel's entire identity? Despite all the different hats I've worn over the years, the most popular thing I've made is still Rise the Wario-likes. For now, it's the only video I've made cited on Know Your Meme. In it, I examine 3 titles that in my opinion capture the essence of my favourite platformer, Wario Land 4. These games are Wario-like because they either evoke the unique style of that GBA game, or reuse its distinctive mechanics, such as escaping back through exploratory levels. That video helped get my work in front of a larger audience, and more importantly, significantly boosted the popularity of these games. What's been very cool is since then, I've been able to network with game developers like those featured and help direct this Wario-likes audience to their work. To me, what made Rise of the Wario-likes appealing was the conciseness of the concept. People love Nintendo games, especially Wario, and they were keen for more of them. However, I was aware that this could be a double-edged sword. For a few vocal opponents, the term Wario-like has created a narrow definition they see as harmful rather than helpful. It ties the Wario genre's identity to a single platformer from 2001, minimizing his rich history and confusing most people who associate Wario today with microgame compilations. More so, the term Wario-like could serve as a cliquey benchmark. For example, the success of Pizza Tower led some toxic fans to criticize new games with similar influences as mere rip-offs. They may have seen my inclusion of Pizza Tower and Wario-likes as endorsing it as the definitive successor. My video never intended to do that. In fact, I asked for recommendations of other titles that could fit this loose definition because I simply wanted to play more games like them, no matter how Wario-like they were. This has since put me in a tricky spot when creators contact me to showcase their work. I want to avoid classifying games as Wario-like or another narrow definition from now on because it limits potential conversation and patronizes their work. But a lack of stickiness with a wider audience risks my endorsements falling into obscurity. Audiences have decided Rise of the Wario-likes best sums up the HOTCYDER channel, and to me that's true, though not in the obvious way. While I have covered Wario before and will likely do so again, my real passion is recommending cool video games, whether they're big ticket titles or low-key independent releases. The latter isn't always going to be the most popular subject matter on YouTube, and that puts pressure on me to grab attention. When I'm not resorting to using Wario's name, one of my favourite methods to get games in front of people is a mixtape format. Short evaluations of often free games, linked by a common thesis. This could be indie titles that vie with a 20-year-old Nintendo game, but it could also apply to city builders that play like puzzle games, alien adventures with great UI design, or simply my favourite games of an event all year. This mixtape format allows me to highlight lesser-known releases alongside attention-grabbing inclusions, and lets me give each game its dues without stretching content to fit YouTube's runtime expectations. It also offers some flexibility in approach and allowance for tangents. Over the years, I've also extended this mixtape metaphor to collaborative videos, featuring contributions from multiple creators. In that sense, it's almost a bit of a digestible magazine format, where each video could be a standalone feature or sit as part of an issue that delves into a few different topics. This introspection has inspired me to try something new. This mixtape of games doesn't have a strong unifying thesis other than this. All titles included are worth your attention, and I'd hope my track record for exploring cool, lesser-known games speaks for itself. Some featured were recommended by other creators, others I discovered through X or Steam, and a few came from keys in my email. Of course, I'll disclose when that's the case. Although I usually save a call to action for the end of the video, I'm keen to make this format a regular thing between more focused essays or previews, and so if you'd like to recommend something you think deserves more attention, whether it be old or new, please feel free to comment below or message me over on X. To those of you that have made suggestions in the past, they'll likely make an appearance here in future. So with all that said, I'd like to present a video indicative of my channel. A curated collection of curiosities that are, undeniably, least appreciated aspect of video games might be the act of playing them. We're quick to reward the best graphics, presentation, performances, music or sound effects, but we rarely if ever celebrate how great interfaces uplift the whole experience. It makes sense as those former elements shine through in screenshots and video, whilst it's difficult to gauge how great a game feels without having it in your control. But that tactility separates the medium from passive art like film or television, and even physical work like theatre, sculpture or glass. So in honour of this oft-overlooked art, I'd like to recommend a demo that won me over entirely through the magic of its interface design. Uncle Chop's Rocket Shop is, in the words of its developers, a roguelike spaceship repair simulator. In the role of a four-eyed, fox-headed humanoid, the goal is to make enough rent to survive another round, done by fixing up fleets of spacefaring sloops. The adventure is set against the backdrop of a backwards meteorite, rendered in an anarchic tone and adult animated aesthetic. Between jobs, you'll mingle with caustic co-workers, spend spare change on new machines, and even uncover satanic secrets. Going purely on its passive qualities, Uncle Chop might not be to everyone's tastes. Although it's not my place to make suggestions, it wouldn't be difficult to tune this adventure for a wider audience by dropping the game's few edgelord swears. But these elements, for better or worse, are gestalt with the game's greatest achievements. Initially, Uncle Chop sliced quickly to my heart because of its focus on interfaces. The act of diagnosing and repairing spaceship components is transformed into a toyetic experience, one that, like the best PC and phone applications, take a simple pointer interface and turns it into skeuomorphic spelunking. There is the immediate fun of pushing buttons, flicking switches, and tuning dials as expected. And despite being set in science fiction, the developers here have done their best to give each of these alien components an intuitive design. But it's when these interactions overlap and build processes that Chop becomes a cut above. The mundane act of an oil check and change becomes a satisfying sequence of undoing screws, flipping pegs, and shuffling out clean and dirty oil, all conducted through clicks, drags, and taps. As difficulty mounts, sometimes these checks aren't so simple, requiring the hood to be opened to inspect components for fractures or failures. For those of you that have never popped a bonnet, this can sound daunting, and at its harshest, Uncle Chop certainly can be. Although there is a constant repair manual to RTFM at any point, time is a premium you can't always afford. That infamous roguelike difficulty mounts when fidgety microgames are done under the clock, requiring a good job done in good time for good pay. I initially wasn't fond of how Chop's roguelike design encouraged multiple failed runs to be taken as a learning experience to figure out the basics. Fortunately, the developers were aware enough to include a timeless mode to figure out these components and overcome challenges without that initial threat of the buzzer. But once you've mastered the maneuvers, it's worth switching the timer back on to add a little hot sauce to the experience. It's that interface design that got me to appreciate all aspects of Uncle Chop's Rocket Shop. The goofy but gruff sense of humour, alien aesthetics, and even that roguelike roughness are what uplifts its already great gameplay. There is a sort of permadeath that threatens progress, and permanent changes that reflect in future rounds. But Rocket Shop stretches the definition of the roguelike for the better. It's like WarioWare, in that you can never expect what's coming up, but through repeat play you'll be equipped for whatever outer space burps up. The same few checks and processes repeat across components, and you'll feel like a real grease monkey when intuition eventually takes the wheel. Uncle Chop's Rocket Shop's demo teases some stranger places for this adventure to go, and I'm keen to see if the developers can pay that off. Although I've done my best through video footage and my writing to promote Uncle Chop, its virtual tactility elevates it above games with better graphics, writing or sound. And for that reason, it really needs to be played. "2003 might be the most important year in the history of French publisher Ubisoft. Alongside the multi-platform release of Xbox superhit Splinter Cell and the return of their mascot Rayman, the publisher would drop 3 titles that would shape their identity in the years following. The first was Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, a fully fledged reboot of Jordan Mechner's PC classic that would provide the basis for Ubi's foundational franchise Assassin's Creed. The second was Beyond Good and Evil, the magnum opus of Rayman designer Michel Ancel, and their first truly prestige release. Although a commercial failure, its world, characters and concept have endured so long that the publisher remains committed to a sequel, even 16 years after it was announced. Finally, Ubisoft Paris would adapt the cult Belgian graphic novel 13 into a first-person shooter of the same name. Initially a flop, it would eventually become a cult object to the extent of being remade in 2020. Its cel-shaded rendering and comic book approach is the title's lasting legacy, inspiring Ubisoft to take similar artistic approaches to familiar genre fare, like their 2D platformer reboot of Rayman and subsequent Ubi Art series. 13's failure may have also made Ubisoft cautious of going too far into artistic territories for big releases, as this would be their last cel-shaded comic-inspired shooter before the Wii's Red Steel 2. I don't like 13 as a whole, but particular elements of it have stuck with me since. The slick presentation of its conspiracy-laden story, GoldenEye-inspired set pieces, and its stacked cast of voice talent, including the X-Files' David Duchovny and Mayor Quahog Adam West.
Those idiots still haven't found a way to fix this station.
It's a game of impeccable vibes, let down by FPS conventions of the time, and so I've always wanted to see the concept done better. Although I can't say it could have been a direct inspiration, it's difficult not to think of these qualities and vibes whilst playing Strange Scaffold's latest release, I Am Your Beast. Set in a world of Cold War-era espionage, starring a one-man army protagonist with a supernatural predilection for killing, I Am Your Beast feels ripped from the same Bond Desiné inspirations as Ubisoft's title. There's a wry US skeptic vein to its writing, and a graphic violence the big two comic publishers usually avoid. Playing as a rebellious secret agent, having done one too many one-last jobs for a CIA-like entity, he has to defend himself against his handlers who have transformed his home in the North American wilderness into close-quarters arenas of mayhem. With its first-person shooting rendered in a striking cel-shaded aesthetic and dripping with similar comic book flair, I Am Your Beast isn't a spiritual successor to 13, but a new recipe that borrows some ingredients. It's a dish modern Ubisoft couldn't make because it can't appeal to the largest audience possible, and so it's fortunate Strange Scaffold have taken on that creative spirit to make something that I absolutely adore. For what kind of first-person shooter it is, I Am Your Beast's design feels in conversation with the speed freak optimization of 2022's Neon White. Beast is a puzzle of mapping the shortest paths between headshots, emulating the methodical and clean killing the main character is being courted over. The goal every round is to escape into the agent's underground tunnel network after leaving no witnesses, using field-procured weapons and advanced mobility to take out a set number of soldiers. Beast taps directly into a power fantasy where everything in the environment is a weapon, and even when you're out of bullets, you're never out of options. At your best, you spend a clip killing 3 soldiers and throw the empty gun at a 4th, before dropping your foot to finish the job, all whilst running at full speed. Scaffold is a small studio and uses its limitations as opportunities to uplift the vibes of I Am Your Beast. Instead of levels being expansive, they're tight, easy to navigate, and short, creating a want to replay, optimize, and master them for better scores. There's room to experiment and play with ideas and secret achievements that all but encourage playing outside the box. Its visual style isn't just cool to look at, but being set in white Spartan wilderness gives every encounter high contrast legibility. Like Super Hot, you never lose track of targets and opportunities. And what ties these killing floors together is an impeccable presentation that goes further than Ubisoft's comic book emulation. Instead of story beats playing out in cutscenes or static images, it's audio drama, punctuated by kinetic typography. Spending their limited budgets wisely, the voice cast of I Am Your Beast is locked into the source material, and how text animates their performances is exceptional. Your playable avatar delivers lines with the same precision as its kills, leaving foes on the battlefield and other end of the line scrambling. During these cutscenes, it feels almost like you're wiretapping clandestine phone lines, privy to an entire world we're usually removed from, and it creates a driving interest for the rest of the game. That creative juice that feels all but gone from AAA creators looking for safe hits is alive and well in Scaffold's I Am Your Beast. While this demo is short and the expected final game won't be much longer, it supports the adage that games should be as long as they need to be, free of padding and artificial inflation. The game's focus on hitting high scores will give it more longevity than multi-hours long campaigns and battle passes possibly could. Instead, the team is focused on making a completely cohesive experience, the kind that used to come from big publishers looking to prove themselves. Spending their money wisely, Strange Scaffold aren't looking to emulate an existing experience in a lesser fashion, but instead cut out their own take on the first-person shooter. It has me all the more interested to check out their reimagining of Max Payne-era new weird shooting in last year's El Paso Elsewhere, and of course, whatever bright ideas are coming next. Did you know that as of this upload, if you say the word subscribe in a video, that animates the subscribe button in the bottom row? Pretty cool, right? Did you also know that if you subscribe to HOTCYDER, you'll get more videos like this in the future? The same goes for if you give this video a like, because then YouTube will be more likely to recommend my work to more viewers. What if you wanted to more directly influence what I make? Well, you could also consider subscribing to the HOTCYDER Patreon, like some of the names right here have done. That money goes directly into the production of videos like this, including upgrading my equipment and covering the cost of games covered. If enough people decide to support me, I could even make videos full time, and avoid having to compromise with adverts in future. So if you think this is good but could be even better, you can genuinely pay to make that happen. Now, back to the cool games. Sometimes all it takes is a fun idea to convince me to demo a game, and this was the case when Dungeon Clawler appeared in my inbox and sold me with its succinct blended pitch. A roguelike dungeon crawler in the vein of Slay the Spire, combined with a claw machine game. Sending a ragtag group of toy bunnies into terrifying tombs is a player's task to queue up attacks, defense, and support items, and that's done by grabbing handfuls of objects and dropping them onto a conveyor. Of course, that's easier said than done, like it is with real crane games. The claw moves along a horizontal line and only descends and grabs when stopped in place, at which point you're no longer in control and wobbly physics kicks in. Giving this concept some additional juice, the objects are literal representations of their function. Great swords and daggers deal damage, shields minimize harm taken, and loose change is added to the character's experience pool at the end of each round. The long and pointy shape of weapons, conflicting with big and bulky shields, creates some trade-off between what to focus on each round. Smaller items yield lesser results but are easier to grab, and vice versa. It creates some strategy and approach, in spite of complete random chance in whether these items will reach their destination. It's fortunate then that each round allows 2 turns of grabbing a handful of goodies, because that first attempt is always going to test a grab before fully committing with a second. As more exotic objects are thrown onto the field, the task of outfitting rabbits becomes more challenging, and in roguelike fashion, eventual death leads to lessons learned. In a year where Balatro dominates by using poker to onboard deck building, it's no surprise other developers are taking a similar peanut butter and chocolate approach to see what great games appear. Dungeon Clawler excels at mining all the great opportunities of its concept, finding fun ways of mixing its crane game layer with the resulting combat. There are enemy types that directly influence that layer, like a poisonous belcher that throws toxic materials amongst what can be grabbed to add some danger amongst the debris. Sometimes water is poured onto the playing field, causing lighter objects to bob on the surface whilst others sink to the bottom. There's creativity to Dungeon Clawler's gimmicks, and that goes too for its cast of characters you slowly unlock through successful runs. One of the first is a cybernetic bunny, and their gimmick replaces one of those claws with a magnet. It guarantees objects are collected and deposited onto the conveyor, but with a twist that it only grabs metallic trinkets like swords, coins, and some trap items. It's quite difficult to hate Dungeon Clawler for how much fun the developers are having with the concept, but ultimately it's not a rogue I particularly like. It's down to that unfair randomness that underpins crane games. Their tests of depth perception and timing, but uneven terrain and object grip, are ultimately out of a player's control. There is strategy in what objects to pick up and what upgrade paths to follow to push item generation to favour players' odds, but these plans hinge on the physics behaving themselves. During play, there were only a few places the claw's physics could be changed beyond outright replacement, so instead Clawler adds more objects to the field, leading to frustration as the gap between what you want to achieve and what actually happened widens. While the roguelike genre thrives on unpredictability, Dungeon Clawler offers few options to recover from bad plays. And with that lack of strategy, the concept loses steam quickly, and I'll admit I lost patience with the title before I saw the entirety of its unlocks.
So I missed.
I don't enjoy giving negative feedback on games, especially ones from new developers who were kind enough to let me review their work for free. So to turn my feedback into a positive, I hope that they can learn from what works and what didn't with Dungeon Clawler for their next release. The team is incredibly talented, and it reflects in how the synergy of the Clawler concept is handled across the game. From the interesting gimmicks they came up with, like magnetic objects and poison debris, to the fact the playable chaos look like the kind of toys you'd pull out of a crane game. This is all an appreciable attention to detail that even the big developers rarely pull off. To separate the chocolate and peanut butter, the claw game itself is fun, and the dungeon crawling element is interesting, but the two elements don't mesh entirely well due to their conflicting player wants. Perhaps next time round, the developers could try and match these elements with more fitting genres. For example, one of my favourite claw crane inspired games of the past few years was HAL Laboratories' Part-Time UFO. Combining a claw grabber with a block puzzle action game, sloppy rigid body physics of a claw can be accounted for by complete character control and the allowance to stop, drop and readjust. UFO doesn't restrict players to completing missions in a number of grabs, but instead lightly rewards players for completing tasks as prescribed, with greater rewards encouraging faster and safer plays. If the developers of Clawler wanted to attempt an RPG-like setting again, the importance of the claw game could be adjusted to have a similar friendliness as Part-Time UFO. Instead of generating attacks and defense, each bunny could have base statistics that are improved through your crane plays. Playing into the comedic, rigid body floppiness inherent to these games, players could be asked to pick their bunnies up and drop them into enemies to directly attack them. But for now, Dungeon Clawler is an interesting experiment that I am recommending, at least for fans of the genre who may gel with it. The strength of its concept is enough to grab attention, but much like the crane games it emulates, that interest can fly away awkwardly when the reality of its rigid body physics and punishing roguelike difficulty sinks in. However, to celebrate the developers' achievements, like how well the concept was explored and all the opportunities they mined from it, I am keen to see what they do next. That even goes for whether it might be another experiment in mashing two notoriously difficult genres together. I don't begrudge anyone who'd take on the task of telling jokes through video games. To avoid Dissecting the Frog, humour manifests from contradictions with our expectations, like an obvious setup and unexpected punchline. This conflicts with video games that are, for all intents and purposes, rigid and familiar systems. We push a button and expect the same result each time. This isn't to say the games can't be funny, because often they are, even when they're trying hard not to be. One of the funniest games the past few years was Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2, not for any of the included writing, but instead because my friend kept throwing character models down the stairs and shooting their reactions in photo mode, disrupting serious scenes of revenge with Ellie and Joel crashing through furniture. Then there's the unexpected results of procedural systems like ragdolls, explosives, and wonky artificial intelligence leading to laughs. These have led to a cottage industry of comedy games like Goat Simulator, Happy Wheels, and Octodad, where the humour comes from wobbly characters bumbling through recognisable situations. But games as a vehicle for well-written jokes are few and far between, mostly because humour isn't a universal constant, and the repetitive and player-led nature of games can dull and often ruin the delivery of punchlines. Great joke games, like great jokes, are best told once in the right situation, like the insult joust of Monkey Island, and not like the assault of meme humour in games of the late aughts. Dissecting Frogs was at the forefront of my mind playing Panic and Cold Supper's latest release. Thank goodness you're here. A point-and-slap adventure game set in the fictional town of Barnsworth, situated somewhere in County Yorkshire, the title sums up how the player character finds themselves thrust into helping strange citizens with their peculiar problems, such as finding grease to remove an arm from a grating, milk for a cup of tea, or preparing a tray of fish smoking ciggies. It's a playable sketch show where you interact either passively or actively with bulging stereotypes, and soak in the minute details of a small working-class town. Like the best comedy games, you're responsible for thank goodness's funniest moments, and because I'm no joke thief, I'll leave you to discover the best of them. I had a smile on my face throughout, and although I never laughed out loud, there are going to be comedic beats I'll be thinking of for a while. I can imagine if you're watching this from the Everglades or United Arab Emirates, you might not find much of Thank Goodness You're Here's humour funny outside of completely off-the-wall moments. But humour is subjective, in this case playing better to an audience broadly like Cold Supper's developers. I vibed with Thank Goodness You're Here almost immediately, and not just because I've grown up in and near towns like Barnsworth. Its style of humour reminded me of classic British comedies like The Farce Show, where no gag hangs around, the strange flights of fancy of The Mighty Boosh, even the small town horror of The League of Gentlemen. All the while, Goodness's very modern cartoon stylings juxtapose in funny ways with its writing's northern soul. It's a surprise that indie publisher Panic funded a game a decimal of the world's inhabitants are going to enjoy, but I implored them for doing so, because those that do will love it. This got me to consider a more interesting aspect of Thank Goodness You're Here as a comedy game. The best jokes are told once in the right situation, and that conflicts with how games now need to target the broadest possible audience and be played every day to satisfy shareholders. Titles like Fall Guys have added some levity to live service games through wobbly ragdolls, but that same approach wouldn't work with doing the same stand-up set every single day. Fortunately, Thank Goodness is a one-and-done experience, and is about as short as a feature-length comedy at around 2 hours, unless a player attempts every quest in town. Its gameplay is also kept relatively streamlined. I'd describe it as Night in the Woods in the north, but it might be even simpler than that, featuring no minigames and presented as a side-scrolling simplified adventure. It's an interactive delivery system for visual gags, written jokes, and the timeless comedy of thick Yorkshire accents.
Thank goodness you're here, man. This store's a madness.
And so complex game systems are stripped out, so not to get in the way. Where other so-called comedy games have struggled to balance length and laughs, Thank Goodness is more concerned with the latter, and all I can say is thank goodness for that. It didn't outstay its welcome, and although some jokes are repeated for comical escalation, there's never the need to replay or retake sections for better odds. It succeeds as a better video game comedy than other more recent attempts as a result, feeling like a nice modernization of older adventure games with smart comedic writing. For its price point, most gamers won't feel as if they got their money's worth. As an enlightened big brain games writer with disposable income from YouTube thumbnails, I was happy to spend about as much as a Domino's pizza on a comedy experience that was tuned exactly on my wavelength. That price to play ratio is always going to be a factor into a game purchase, but cost rarely if ever affects good joke telling in other mediums. Those 3 UK comedies I mentioned were all produced by the BBC, the corporation paid by a UK arts tax to fund radio, film and television for all parts of the UK, not just the major population areas. In that respect, Thank Goodness You're Here feels like a game that could have only existed from a country with a public service broadcaster. Although it has touchstones of beloved comedies, a bottom line of appealing to everyone wasn't at the forefront of Cold Supper's mind, because if it was, they never would have made a comedy game like Thank Goodness You're Here. It isn't for everyone, and that's for the best, because its uncompromising humour is funnier than recycled internet memes could ever be. To me, Thank Goodness You're Here teases a perfect world where the BBC could use some of its public fund to invest in the British games industry and independent creators. So we could get more one-off, short but sweet games exactly like Thank Goodness You're Here, made by developers from across the country to represent their own British values. Uncompromised by having to appeal to advertisers or big business, developers get the allowance to tell the best kind of jokes. Short, sweet, and to the point. And no gamers feel ripped off because it's the same tax that pays for Planet Earth, Radio 1, and EastEnders. Thank Goodness You're Here is what independents excel at, telling stories and jokes that big publishers would find too niche to be profitable. As one of the few games that is a genuine delivery system for jokes, hopefully its success may get other budding comedians to appear on Steam. But in the spirit of humour coming out of the incongruous, I would absolutely love to see the reaction of a Monster Energy swigging, banned from Twitch, edgelord Yank to Thank Goodness You're Here. Would its jokes transcend language barriers? Would they see something of their own life in the cartoon depictions of everyday working people? Or instead, would they crack their own jokes on top of it? After all, sometimes humour doesn't come naturally out of games, but instead when we break and bend them to do unexpected things. Hello, I hope you're enjoying Cool Games Volume 1 so far. As mentioned earlier, I'd be keen to hear if you like this new format and want to see it again in the future. Mixtapes say a lot about the people who make them, not just through what's been included, but also how selections have been sequenced. To that effect, if you'd like to rework this sequencing yourself and maybe include other relevant videos to make your own mixtape, you can access an unlisted playlist version of Cool Games Volume 1 in the description. I'd be keen to see your own unique approach, whether it's collating a few essays covering Citizen Sleeper or maybe the topic of comedy games. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this short break, and now we head back onto the cool games. Sega's dominance in arcade racing is unique because it's not associated with just one game or year, but instead an entire era that saw technology and taste change. Sometimes they were at the forefront as taste makers, but others were reacting to new trends. As a result, you can find people who adore one specific example of Sega's driving games, but not the rest, making it appealing for new developers to dig into each game as a starting point for something new. On the one end, you have the early superscalar scorcher, Outrun. Eschewing from Grand Prix races at the time, AI opponents are swapped out with a countdown that saps away precious time you spend behind the wheel of a Ferrari Testarossa, blasting through lush scenery to the sound of magical sound shower. It's a game where you race not just to impress, but instead to endure an awesome vibe for as long as possible. On the other end of the era, their early forays into polygonal races like Daytona USA and Sega Rally have an aesthetic that has become timeless. Although more conventional racing games, their bold look and robust physics are an unreality more appealing than our own, where fun and function is put above lavish recreation. As graphics and physics have only grown more accurate and photoreal for driving games, these titles have endured for striving for their own fantasy, whether that be behind the wheel of a Ferrari on a infinite 80s runway, or blasting through low-poly muddy trails in a souped-up rally car. It may be no surprise then that I have two games to recommend that feel like they're aiming to recapture the glory of these two separate eras of Sega. So I'd like to introduce a televised event for the ages, the Sega-inspired Racing Game Showdown. In the red corner, weighing at 67 meg, developed by Skydevil Palm and published by Playtonic Friends, is Victory Heat Rally, a melding of superscalar aesthetics with Mario Kart mayhem. I had played a demo of this earlier in the year at the indie festival WASD and have been keen to cover it, although at the time didn't have much of an interesting thesis beyond how it adapts Outrun, not through recreating how it was, but instead how we remember it. Sunny beaches, neon colours and blazing fast draw speeds. This has let the developers' creative minds shine as they go further in their inspirations. Its cast of racers vie with the big personalities of Street Fighter and F-Zero. Its user interface design owes more to the bold look of Sonic Mania than Sega's own releases. Even its beach babes, used as tutorial prompts and storytellers, likely owe something to Ridge Racer. Gameplay-wise, there is no choppy superscalar technology being used here, but instead levels are fully polygonal, allowing racers to play out as fast and frantically as wanted, while keeping a legible aesthetic reminiscent of that hardware. That goes too for vehicles that are rendered in Super Mario Kart style as pre-rendered sprites that rotate and deform as they turn. It's a unique look that initially I didn't quite get, but in the heat of racing, getting a sense of how much I was turning was appreciated, and designing them slightly tilted back allows a wider view of the road ahead. It pushes Heat Rally out of being too indebted to Sega's Outrunners and helps it become entirely its own thing. While not exactly channeling the Race to the Sunset vibes of the original Outrun, Victory blazes its own path that is unabashedly cartoon, more toyetic and playful. The kind of game you'd imagine could have been a Sega Saturn transition title mixing great sprite work with the benefits of early 3D. After my time with the demo, I'm excited to see what a full campaign of Victory Heat Rally looks like, but more so I'm keen to pop it into my rotation of multiplayer games. It's fast, it's fun, and very easy to pick up and play. Of all the Outrun style games I've played over the years, this one appreciates from going the extra mile and finding its own unique vibe to cultivate. In the blue corner, weighing at 104 meg and developed by the creator of Jellycar, is Parking Garage Rally Circuit. I've wanted to play this game the moment I saw it in Twitter dev videos, not just for its unique gameplay, but also how pitch perfect a pastiche it was of Sega Rally, down to vivid transparency effects and affine texture warping. As its name suggests, this rally doesn't take place on rough natural terrain, but instead in cramped and concrete parking complexes, one still in active use as parked cars act as barriers. In an ironic subversion of Sega's classic races, you still visit exotic locations around the world with fitting vistas and landmarks, but you won't see any of them while driving around the same low overhead structures. With this change in location, PGRC is a challenge of managing your turns and mastering drifting for small bursts of speed, whether you're doing a time attack or racing against AI components. These tracks are so short they're akin more to FPS arenas, encouraging you to quickly replay and master them in a matter of minutes. Like the attention to physics of this previous title Jelly Car, the handling model here is a nice Sega mix of function and realism that favours fun, letting you turn on a dime and correct drifting easily. It's a style of racing that I haven't got to enjoy outside of Dirt Free's Gymkhana mode and the tutorial level of Driver 1, and I'm glad to see a dedication to it here. I'm also wowed by the attention to detail taken with its graphical effects. Before the game begins, you're presented with a PC settings window at a time, and can choose between emulating the look of a Sega Saturn with scan lines, distortion and a lower frame rate, a PC mode that bumps specs to the max, or a custom menu that lets you tweak which features you want on and by how much. After all, not everyone grew up playing Sega games in the arcades and may be better used to their look either on CRTs or LCDs, and so the allowance to better tune the nostalgia is appreciated. It's difficult to choose a clear winner between these two Sega-inspired racing heavyweights, not only because they emulate two distinctly different eras of races, but both punch well above their weight in their unique categories. Comparing Victory Heat Rally to kart racing and Outrun-inspired games, its allowance for full 3D tracks, unique race types, and a colourful cast make it stand out amongst the Steam showroom. However, it's difficult to compare Parking Garage Rally Challenge to anything because it is so unique in its setup. If I had to choose which I prefer, PGRC might win, only as I've never really played anything like it. Where Heat Rally also gave me quite a lot of demo to enjoy, there's so little of PGRC right now to feel satisfied with it. I've mastered its few tracks to get the best times right now, but I need to see what more can be done with its concrete parking structures. It's a game for car dorks like myself, whereas Heat Rally is the bigger crowd pleaser. But both games are on Steam to try yourself, and I'd be interested to know in the comments which prize fighter you're rallying behind. You probably don't need another recommendation for Jump Over the Ages 2022 indie darling Citizen Sleeper. This exceptional science fiction game has been thoroughly analysed and advocated by far more qualified writers who've delved deeply into its themes of transhumanism, identity, and living in the age of apocalypse. Personally, I thought I'd only ever appreciate Citizen Sleeper through passive writing, and avoid playing it myself. Not because of its synopsis, themes, or even its presentation, but instead preconceived genre expectations. For all intents and purposes, Citizen Sleeper is a tabletop-inspired role-playing game, and that's usually shorthand to mean the game is a digital version of Dungeons & Dragons. Released last year, Baldur's Gate 3 is the most apt example of that kind of RPG, especially as its design is indebted to the latest version of D&D. It's a grand fantasy adventure you're expected to play for dozens of hours, where thrilling action is dictated by character positioning, action points, and rolling giant dice. And the most exciting thing that can happen is passing a charisma check to generate new dialogue options. While undeniably impressive, Baldur's Gate 3 highlights why traditional RPGs don't appeal to me, because their focus on numbers and random chance feels too rigid. My distaste of D&D stands in spite of Game Mastering, a tabletop podcast for 2 seasons on this channel. The difference is I avoided D&D and instead ran a simplified version of Powered by the Apocalypse, a system that underpins games like the titular Apocalypse World, Monster of the Week, Spirit of 77, and Dungeon World. I chose PBTA over the more widely available D&D, so I didn't bog down guests in rules and mechanics, and gave them greater room to improvise. PBTA systems minimize numbers and use visuals to illustrate progress. They employ fail-forward mechanics where actions always have consequences instead of rigid successful failure, and they put players in control of shaping a plot's direction. This is why I finally decided to play Citizen Sleeper, not because of how great I heard it was, but instead after seeing something incredibly minor none of these previous pieces of writing picked up on. The game tracked progression with clocks, just like PBTA systems I recognized. Lead designer Gareth Damian Martin even said that its systems were inspired by the PBTA spin-off Blades in the Dark, a fantasy gang adventure that blends board game elements with traditional tabletop. Fortunately, like Blades, Citizen Sleeper is a board game that's never boring. When a player starts Citizen Sleeper, they'll be presented by clocks ticking up and down. Cast as a soul trapped in a decaying cybernetic frame, Citizen Sleeper is a story in the cyberpunk tradition of not saving the world, but saving yourself. A rather poignant metaphor, survival is tied directly to a medication that keeps this frame functioning, and that dictates how many activities are done in a cycle. At full health, players are randomly generated a currency of 6 dice that can be used to influence how activities unfold. To give a simple example, one of the main means to generate income that can be spent on medication is through doing salvage jobs. If a player decides to spend a 6 or 5 on this task, they pass it without complication and make some money. But spending a 3 or 4 may throw a complication into the mix. Perhaps they raise suspicion, take harm that eats into survival, or even lock themselves out of doing this activity for a cycle. This strategy applies to almost every decision on the station, and as the game goes along, players will find themselves having to choose between their own immediate survival and helping out others to open new avenues of saving themselves. Fortunately, there are no truly bad results in Citizen Sleeper. Although a cycle may generate a strings of 1s and 2s, these can be spent doing digital spelunking through the station or even progressing safer activities. Through upgrades, dice can even be re-rolled or their effects improved. Rigid failures happen rarely, and their consequences open up new story paths. There's also no rigid adherence to a prescribed plot in Sleeper, and at any point a player can decide to spend their activity points where they're most interested in pursuing, opening entirely new branches to explore. Although there's still a focus on dice and decision making, Citizen Sleeper doesn't follow conventional RPG interface design. In fact, it can be played with nothing more than a pointer. Jump over the age, eschewed from well-established game interfaces, and embrace design more in common with iPad apps and web pages. The game itself would feel fantastic on a big touchscreen slate where you can scroll through this big rotating station, click on hotspots to visit new locations, tap in dialogue choices, and drag dice onto activities to progress clocks. As a result, I didn't burn out playing Citizen Sleeper, and could comfortably dig into its science fiction story. Because there are no immediate world-ending threats except for keeping the player frame alive, Sleeper is like a garden that can be tended to in short bursts. Cycles last only a few minutes but always lead to something interesting. My first playthrough was completed after a few hours and ended in a thematically touching way that I don't wish to spoil here. However, with gained experience, my second playthrough was far more involved, touching on almost every questline as to help everyone I could on the station. Citizen's greatest power fantasy isn't completing every quest perfectly, but it's when you have your own means to create medication and generate steady income. Something that many in our reality could only dream of. Digital versions of Dungeons & Dragons can still be weighed down by the baggage of that series mechanically and spiritually. Although new adventures break from gender norms and antiquated racial stereotypes, D&D's underlying mechanics are still exercises in conquest and power, born from its wargaming origins. While PBTA systems aren't a perfect substitute, many were created with the intent of subverting those tropes, to create stories that could be more queer, expressive, or grounded, giving them a greater empathy. Citizen Sleeper feels born from that same ethos, and like the best science fiction, is both a means for marginalized people to imagine a more freeing world to highlight flaws in our own society. This adventure isn't aimed only at seasoned RPG players looking to min-max, but instead could reach absolutely anyone, even those who may never have played a video game before. Citizen Sleeper uses its systems masterfully to illustrate that you're not playing as a super soldier expected of the genre, but instead you have to consider where you can give 110% on any given cycle. What initially begins as a story of short-term survival by doing social legwork for sheltered individuals, eventually blossoms into fuller stories where you discover the true generosity, loyalty, and tenacity of everyday people. Citizen Sleeper demonstrates that warmth isn't cast down from a distant star, but instead is found amongst those around you. You have been watching Cool Games Volume 1 on the HOTCYDER channel. Leave this window open to move on to the next queued video.